Hey folks, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about a little bit kind of more of a serious topic, and then we'll go right into the original stuff that we normally always talk about. But with the spread of the coronavirus, a lot of folks out there are shopping up on supplies, and just buying up a lot of essential items, food. Toilet paper seems to be the biggest thing around now, and many folks can't get them because they're being bought up so quickly. And as the virus continues to spread, and it'll likely continue for at least for some time, is what many experts would say. There might be a point where people go to the grocery store and they might not find the stuff they need, and a lot of folks are kind of wondering, well, is there going to be a point where people get desperate and will there be break-ins so that people can steal supplies from others? And that's not really like a new concept or a new fear that people are afraid of. It's been around there. Anyone who's into doomsday prepping, of course, right next to their water supply and their provisions, they're of course going to have guns to defend that. Um, and so that's not new, and we're not really there at the point yet. But that question brings up is, well, what if you don't have access to firearms? What if or you choose not to, and you want to go down a less than lethal route to defend your stock or your family or whatever? Are any of these guns here that are less than lethal going to be effective? Can anything that's like CO2 or gas powered or even electric powered, can these things really stop, like, say, someone breaking in and threatening you or your supplies, in these times? And the answer is it depends. No, I'm kidding. It does not. The answer is no. You can stop the video right now. The answer is no. Okay, these guns are not designed to stop people. The rounds they fire and the energy at which they come out of the gun, it's just not going to be adequate. The most that you can really stop with even the more high caliber ones. Or the higher velocity ones are really just going to be a squirrel. That's the largest animal you can take down with these. So think about that for a minute. So the answer is no. So that's the serious stuff. If you really plan on defending it, the only you know thing you really need to invest in a real firearm. And not one that fires like 9mm and so forth. But again, to answer that question, no. But let's talk about more of like the fun stuff behind these, and what are their uses in a situation like this? Is there any reason for them to be using any of these guns? What we'll talk about now is that let's start with the basics, because back in the cases where you might not have access to firearms, but you kind of want something to potentially help you. During like the 2017 immigration crisis in Europe, their laws are a lot stricter, but certain people were concerned, like, well, is there an issue of immigration and crime? Is there a correlation? And we're not here to talk about that at all. This is never the place for this on this channel for that kind of stuff. But people were like, hey, we can't get our hands on guns in certain country, and so what people do, they're running to the store and trying to get something that's comparable that could defend themselves. And really, again, the answer back to what I said earlier, these won't help you with that. Unless you were really firing like the higher velocity ones that were based on like the CO2 power cartridges here. And you were aiming at their face and you were hitting them in their eyes, and they were unprotected. That's really the only deterrent if you were actually going to use their functions. The only real, I guess, like saving grace is if they're more of like a disguise or more used for deception, and I think that might help a little bit more. So what I mean by that is someone breaks in and you pull out a Glock. If the assailant only has a knife, or maybe they're not even armed, period, no one who looks at a Glock that's been pulled out on them are going to ask, well, is that a 9mm, or is that a 45, or is that one of those like 22 conversion kits that are chambered in a lower capacity and I can take a risk? No one's going to really think of that in that situation for the most part, unless again, if they were unarmed, that would be the logical reason. Unless they were so desperate, that they're trying to take that gamble and hoping you miss or fire, then your whole cover's blown. But basically, the only opportunity then is that, hey, look, any firearm, any caliber, at like someone who's faced with that, that's going to inflict serious damage, and they're not going to question that unless they are in a situation where they really need to. So again, the only time when these can be helpful is potentially in that deception role. Um, the other role is potentially if you were looking for something that can maybe, and I mean, we're stretching here, but maybe if you wanted some wild game, like I said, like rodent size meals, like we're talking rats or squirrels only, nothing larger than that. And we would really be focusing on using the more uh, the longer barrel length that would and higher capacity. So it would have to be this version right here with a longer barrel, and it wouldn't even be the CO2 one. I mean, it wouldn't even be the gas powered one. It would have to be the CO2 powered one, or maybe something like this right here, like an MP5 that's CO2 powered. That's got the longer barrel, and so that's what we would probably be looking for if they were even to be that role. So let's get into though which ones, if you had to use them in a situation, which one would be, I don't know, something that you potentially could make some use of and maybe find some utility in it. But again, just a reminder in case you didn't catch it before, no, do not spend your money and time on these items if you were really trying to prepare and get serious for the virus. This is something like, hey, if you already have it in your house, let's try to make it work and make a fun video out of it. But this is really only for entertainment value, and it's not going to help really with anything. So let's get on it. Well, let's talk about the CO2 or the duster gas ones first. So Tokyo Marui, all the Marui ones, I do not recommend to start off with, because these are some of the criteria. I think if we were to choose one, it's like a last-ditch scenario. You got no other options, and you just want, that mainly for that disguise purpose, that deception role that we were talking about, and potentially, maybe, if they were, there's a squirrel or something that you need to take down or something like that and like eat it. You want something that actually can deliver a little bit of a punch, but whatever. Let's just run with this for the fun of this video. You want something that's reliable. You want something that is not going to leak. Essentially, it needs to be under storage for long-term periods of time. You need to be fairly durable, and you want something that is obviously realistic in the role, that it will, can be easily, confused with a real 9mm version or its real counterpart. And you likely want something that actually fire at the highest FPS possible in as many conditions as possible. So based on those criteria that we talked about, that rules out the Marui for the most part. Yes, there's no one that can distinguish the gas blowback version from the 9mm Glock. If you were just to look at this, even close up, you really would have a hard time deciphering unless you like flip it over and read, the exact, engravings on it. It's like, wait a minute, that's not the real one, and or at least like held it and you can feel it. So this is duster gas. It would not, the slide is of a polymer material. If you dropped it, it would not be durable. Cold conditions out there, duster gas performs horribly. You would not even be able to take down a hummingbird with this under those conditions. So this would be out of the picture. The storage itself, the gas does keep its, in there for quite some time, and I've never had any issues with leakages on this one model here. But it's not something I would recommend because of those things. So that would be out. In general, something like the Elite Force, like this one right here, would be reasonable, but again, I don't recommend the CO2 version. The green gas version. Those tend to leak. I'm not the only one who has issues with them. Multiple other folks have had issues with them. You are stepping up to something that's a little bit more durable and a little bit more hard hitting compared to the Marui. Temperature is still a problem, of course, because it is green gas, and it is susceptible to colder weathers. So it's not going to be like a quote-unquote all-weather situation that you can use. And it's just not as reliable in terms of the leakages unless you get different magazines for it. So potentially, if you do choose to use this one, I would probably swap it out for maybe a WE metal magazine, potentially, if you had to. Again, I don't think that's, or if you had the the original one, but you knew for sure that it did not leak, then maybe. But again, cold weathers and the reputation of these magazines so far, I'm just not thrilled with the Elite Force. But, a reasonable choice if you made some magazine replacements. Then comes the rifles, right? And I think where we draw the line here is that I think if you were to choose like any of these, even including this one, right? I think the concealability of a handgun is a lot more useful than carrying around something that attracts a lot more attention, like an SMG or a submachine gun or a full-on rifle right here. For example, if you were going to put something like in your, your ready to go bag like this right here, right? You're going to want something that fits, in neatly into the pockets or something like that. You don't want to be slinging around like a rifle like this. It's going to attract a lot of attention, and it's just not something that you really want to, get behind. It's just, if you had to have something, it would need to be concealable. So that's important. But let's talk about it, since we did mention here. If you were going to up the game and bring out something like an SMG, this would not be something that you would bring with you on a bag escape, where you grab a bag, a 72-hour, 24-hour bag, and run with you. You would not carry this around. This is more if you're, quarantine yourself, you're in your house, and, maybe you got access to some, something in the back. This might potentially be a little bit better agent to potentially send more rounds downrange at a higher FPS, with more accuracy, because it has a larger capacity as well, magazine. So it might be something that you can work with, really. Again, small game, right? And if you miss the first couple of shots, because it has a larger capacity, it has selective fire function, you might be able to get a little bit more out of it. Again, it comes down to reliability issues, mainly the green gas version, as always, susceptible to temperature and susceptible to leakages. So you just can't really store them for a while and expect them that when you pull the trigger, that round will come flying out there. It's just not reliable, especially with the magazines that WE supplies with them. I'm just not a huge fan, unless you change out the O-rings, but even then, not really a recommended. So again, you don't always carry around a CO2 or a green gas tank behind you to fill those magazines if they're low. You fill them once, and you expect these magazines. I know this is not the right magazine for it, but it's an example. You fill up a magazine, you load up with rounds, and you load up the gun, and you expect it to work when you want it, when you need it to work, right? And that's the ideal property. In general, you're just not really going to get that with these magazines. Just that, the coldness, the O-ring just really takes a toll on it. Maybe in the summer month, it might be more beneficial, but with the winter, especially something if we're talking about this virus right now, right, during this cold season, it might be more problematic. Let's go on to the rifles right now. Now let's bring out the rifles. So this is more for again back to the theme of what we're talking about. I wouldn't be carrying this. Would not be carrying this outside. In a situation where it's slung around my neck or something like that. This is just not a good idea to do that. Again, all that negative attention. But again, if you were inside, you're in your house, and you had something to shoot something like, or maybe even a situation where maybe a stray dog comes in and you need to ward it away or something like that. This might be something that's reasonable to do so. But again, it suffers from the same downfall as, say, the MP5 or any of these other guns for the most part, is that it is CO2. It's green gas in nature, and these magazines are susceptible to leaking. I will recommend, though, that if you were to choose to use this gun in a situation like this, I would probably have it equipped with the 20-round Vietnam Air style magazines instead. These magazines are a lot more reliable than the 30-round magazine, just like the real history. Funny at one point. But anyway, even this is the version 2 right here. This one just isn't as reliable. It doesn't fire as hard for some reason, and it just doesn't. It tends to leak a lot more. This one occasionally does leak, but like I said, it's just less, and it seems much more reliable. So if you were to choose one, I would choose this. Alternatively, you could use the CO2 version of the magazines, and those would also be helpful as well, because the CO2 version does tend to be more resistant to the cold. However, that's not to say that every CO2 magazine works. I bought a tan version. Oh, where is it? Let me pull it out real quick. Here we go. This is a tan version of the CO2 magazine, and it has a lot of issues. I've actually fired in this gun, and remember, I run a real steel mil spec spring and buffer in the back, and obviously the CO2 isn't enough to cycle that. But even when I run the stock lighter spring and buffer in the back, the CO2 just isn't as reliable. The magazine itself does tend to leak for some reason. So for the gas rifle blowback series, the CO2 theory and being a quote unquote more reliable just isn't as applicable. So I would still recommend in my situation or in your situation, if you were to go with this, to go with the 20 round magazine, a more reliable version with green gas, or one of the more, I think it was the black gas, where it's more, it operates better under colder temperatures. And because it leaks less with this magazine, and try something like this. You can reliably get more energy, velocity out of this gun, and the longer barrel, as you can see, really helps with that with accuracy. Not to mention though that if you were also going to use this rifle as a deceptive strategy or deception strategy, it's a lot more recognizable. Unfortunately, because of all what you see on the news and stuff about this, than say something like the MP5. Not a lot of folks really recognize this, even though unless you were actively involved in like the history and you read up on it, people wouldn't recognize this as much as some people say, "Hey, is that an AK-47?" You're holding that, and obviously, if you're watching this channel, you clearly probably know what this is already, right? And this is like the MP5. You wouldn't need, to you, yes, it would make sense, but a lot of folks out there, they don't know that, and if they don't know for sure what it is, it might bring into question, and they might call your bluff, right? Whereas if they see something that is a lot more recognizable and probably more ubiquitous, something like this, hey, they might call it an AR, or I mean, they might call it an AK, but they know, hey, I've seen that before. I know that lays down some serious firepower, right? And so it just helps to work your bluff better if you are really going down that route. Forget about what we just talked about earlier, but just from a deception standpoint, this would be a better device to use, a better gun to use to pass off than something like that's more like unknown. If I was to pull out like a P90, people would be like, "What the, what is that?" Like they might not know it. They might think it's like a super soaker you're pulling out. So that's for the rifle. That's for your AR platform. I will say though that the last line is right here is this MP5. It's more of the full stock version, so it does carry a little bit more size to it, but I think this one's nice in the sense that it has a larger magazine capacity. It's 30 round magazine and it's running CO2, and this magazine for the SRC version right here is very reliable. I would probably fire mostly single shots, and having that 30 round capacity with the high velocity from a CO2 and a longer barrel, I think it will be useful if you need to, hunt squirrel or whatever. It just sounds not very serious where, I know when you say like the largest game you can take down is a squirrel, but hey, it is what it is, and that's, if you're trying to work with what you got, this is what you've got. So, if I were to choose one, I would probably still go with the WE XM177 or the WE AR-15 series with a 20 round magazine for both quote-unquote reliability reasons and for the ubiquitous nature of the gun that's easily recognizable. Something like this isn't as recognizable, but it is technically more reliable and operational wise. So there's no perfect choice right here among the rifles. And let alone you would not want to be carrying this around if you were mobile, but in-house, I guess you can choose either one. Now, if you were going to grab that get out and go bag and just head for the woods or whatever, or somewhere in the city at a friend's house, what I probably would recommend that tends to fit this criteria is the the Elite Force half gas blowback that's ran on CO2. This is a CO2 cartridge. It looks almost identical to the real steel Glock, but obviously it fires off a CO2 cartridge. Very reliable, and I hadn't had this for very long, so I can't completely say it with truth, but I've had other Umarex models before where I've put a CO2 cartridge in the magazine, punctured the seal, shot a few rounds, left it in the freezer for almost a year, actually more than a year, pulled it out, and I mean, obviously if you pull it out under freezer temperatures, it's not going to operate very well, but the point is that the seal held, and once you warmed it up again, it was still firing at the right range, and the seal and the pressure was still there. So, and it operates very well. I mean, provided the you don't drop below a certain point with the temperature. But a CO2 was going to be a little bit more reliable than these other gas, and certainly more reliable than dust or gas. So I would recommend this one. You would also, just from the looks department, it would definitely not going to, fool anyone if you look at super carefully, but because of, but it's not, again, it's going to be very difficult to tell anywhere further than a couple of feet. It might be very difficult to tell whether this is a real 9mm, 22 or 6mm round, it's just impossible. You can also attach real steel attachments to it. So I've attached the APL, the Inforce flashlight on it, because this would be very helpful in a situation if you need to use it. It's more of a blinding tool, but it's useful. It attaches and it works very well. And again, because it's CO2 and it holds well in cold temperatures, we know it works in the reliability factor. I've seen it fire. I've done torture tests with not this version, but a similar version as the P99, and it's done very well. And so you can rely on this gun to hold its pressure when you need it to, and the rounds can stay under compression. And when you pull the trigger when you need to, you can pretty much bet it will fire when you need it to fire. Passes the looks test, passes the reliability test. This is actually a steel slide that's a lot more reliable and durable than these alloyed ones, and certainly a lot more powerful and reliable, or more durable than these polymer ones right here. And so I would probably recommend this, and you can fit it. It's more concealable. It will fit in that bag like we talked about earlier. So if you, at the end of the day, I would probably recommend the Elite Force half blowback CO2 pistol as a end of the world scenario, where you're using a less than lethal force to carry with you that potentially might carry you some benefit of hunting game. Again, the range isn't as good as, say, the rifle ones we saw earlier, but it fires a strong enough FPS or the velocity that you probably would be able to take out a squirrel. So hope you all found that content really interesting, especially in this time. And just a kind of a brief overview of all these different options out there, and it's kind of just fun to see what if, kind of a what if scenario. Again, don't get too serious about this, because it probably you really need to get a 9mm or higher if you're really going to go down that road. But if you're stuck with no choice, these are some things you can potentially consider, but it's really more just for the entertainment value of today's video. All right, folks, thanks a lot. See y'all next time.